Hello everybody. I'm Tim Hurd. I can hear people still joining the webinar, and that's fantastic. I'm Tim Hurd, Business and Channel Manager, Silk Road Australia, and I'll be your host and introducing your guest speaker shortly. Before we get to proceed with the presentation today, I'd like to run through a couple of items. The format for today's webinar will be a brief 5-minute-ish introduction to Silk Road and Julian Fenwick. The main event, social learning strategies for compliance training. We'll follow that, and finally we'll wrap up the session today with a Q&A session. And with regards to that last point on the Q&A session, we only have one house rule. If you have a question, which I hope there's a few of them, please write it in the GoToMeeting Q&A section, which is toward the bottom, which will be enabled once the webinar started. We can't promise that we'll get through all questions, but we'll certainly give it our best shot during the webinar, and we'll certainly answer all questions afterwards. Okay, so on to the presentation and a bit about Silk Road. Silk Road's suite of products are designed to help organisations manage their staff from pre-hire to retire. What differentiates Silk Road from other vendors in our space is that we have a suite of solutions, all of which can be bought independently or integrated on the Life Suite, and we typically work with clients from a few hundred employees to around 5,000 plus. That said, our solutions are scalable, and we have many large enterprises as customers. Now, in the context of talking of GRC solutions presenting, Silk Road recognises that the various web-based cloud SaaS offerings that we have are extremely effective in managing GRC-related content. From projecting a public image of an ethical organisation that is an employer of choice and a good corporate citizen via an organisation's career page, to ensuring that all staff, new starters, managers and transitional staff are aware of what their induction and compliance requirements are, and that those activities have visibility right throughout the organisational structure. By avoiding a potentially bullying or harassment complaint around appraisal time by having a robust and structured procedure in place that encourages ongoing communication through the entire appraisal period, Silk Road helps mitigate lost productivity and potential financial impacts of legal proceedings concerning bullying and harassment complaints. Then, of course, Silk Road will foster social learning to increase participation rates in compliance training, and will audit an individual's knowledge via our enterprise LMS. Silk Road is a little different from your average software company. Our CEO and founder was CEO of the company that had the largest software IPO of the 1980s, and in the 1990s he founded a company called Platinum Technologies, which he grew from 0 to 15,000 employees globally, and subsequently sold to Computer Associates for $3.5 billion US. Silk Road are recognised as one of the leading independent players in the talent management space, a market which has seen considerable consolidation over the past few months. Unlike other companies, we don't need to sell. That's one of the benefits of having a wealthy owner. While all the consolidation has been happening, Silk Road have been investing heavily in our Asia-Pacific expansion, and we're now present in over 10 locations, from Beijing and Tokyo in the north to Sydney and Melbourne in the south. Our philosophy as a company is very simple: keep our employees happy. If we're able to do that, then our employees will keep our customers happy, and they in turn will keep our investors happy. So employee engagement is something that we at Silk Road live and breathe. We very much hope you enjoy the presentation today, and if you'd like to review it at any time, a recording will be sent to you within 48 hours. So, with that, I'll introduce Julian Fenwick, the CEO of GRC Solutions, our main speaker today. GRC Solutions is a leading publisher of online legal compliance training materials in the Asia Pacific region. They work with major law firms in the region to produce a range of courses which can be delivered either off the shelf or customised to suit your requirements. The team at GRC Solutions maintain the courses for legal accuracy to ensure that your staff have access to the most current material. Today's presenter, Julian Fenwick, has been working in the online compliance area for over 12 years. Julian has assisted many major corporations in developing their online compliance training strategy, and over this time has seen many changes in the development of effective training programs. His presentation today looks at the development of social learning strategies for compliance training. Now I'll hand you over to Julian for the main event.
Great, thanks Tim. Yes, look, today I'm wanting to talk about social learning strategies, and I'm going to sort of premise the presentation by saying that we're going to whip through this relatively quickly, but as Tim said, a recording will be available for those people who are interested in it. One of the first things that we want to look at is where we've come from and where we're going to in the future. I think what we've all seen with compliance training over the years is a lot of resistance from people who actually end up having to do the training and those people who do it year on year. And we've come to a point where we need to actually push ourselves a little bit harder and do a little bit more to make sure that our training is engaging as we go through. So if we look back at my career, certainly in this industry, we've come a long way. Certainly back in the year 2000, we were very much looking at the sort of ticker box view of compliance training, understanding that most organisations were training their staff with a view to having evidence that they'd trained their staff. So really looking at it as more of an insurance policy rather than worrying about whether people had actually learned anything. I think over that time we've seen legal content reviewed and written as though it was training materials, and then really started to move into that instructional design era around 2004. Around 2006 and 2008 we started to see more of a push towards content specific for different organisations or different industries, and try to customise things for the end user, so they didn't feel as though that the training wasn't written for them, but more that it was applicable in their industry or their job role. And then moving to a sort of methodology, particularly in our business, of developing modular content that was able to be there, some depending on different job roles or risk profiles, depending on the users in the organisations. And now we're seeing an even bigger push towards profile-driven and self-selected content. The amount of information that is out there for people in the cyber world means that there is so much more that we can offer people, and that they are being sort of encouraged to try and find it for themselves. But firstly, I'd like to sort of start with looking at what is compliance and why is it necessary. And I know we're probably going to be covering some of the basics, but I think it never hurts to sort of come back to, why are we doing this? And looking at, what is the purpose of all this additional training that we can continually pushing down onto our staff. So looking at it, compliance at its very basic is an organisation's legal obligations to adhere to prescribed statutes and standards. We talk about it in Australia particularly as being mandatory requirement for all organisations, in particular governed by the standard AS 3806. We look at state and Commonwealth legislation and industry body codes of practice as well. And our obligations include the provision of appropriate training to staff and contractors that's done in a consistent and timely manner. Often we get this sort of a response where people feel, oh, not this again. Yawn, yawn, yawn. But I think the key thing that we should be doing is having a look at what all the fuss is about. If we keep going on the dry sort of, this is the law, this is the legislation, you must apply it to your business, you're hardly going to get engagement from your people. But what we like to talk to our clients about is personalising it, making sure that the individuals who are responsible for different areas of your business understand why compliance is important. And I think most businesses today would all agree that we all want to work in a safe environment. We want to work in an environment that's free from harassment and discrimination. We want to deal with businesses who compete on a level playing field, and we want our customers and consumers to feel that they're getting a fair deal. In Australia in particular, we have compulsory superannuation, which means that all of us are technically investors within the stock market, whether we like it or not. And so we want to know that those companies are behaving in an ethical and perhaps even a risk-averse manner to protect and grow our investment for our retirement. The last thing we want to see is these businesses collapse because of an insider trading or a rogue trader example. And particularly since the GFC, we've seen a lot of discussion around compliance and what we should be doing better. To bring this back home in Australia, a lot of the local governments invested in products that they really didn't understand via Lehman Brothers, and as a result lost millions and millions of dollars that didn't technically belong to the local councils. It belonged to the ratepayers within those within those areas. So I think we have to look at it and say, well, what is what does compliance mean for the individual as much as it means for the organisation? Taking it back up to the organisation level, we can look at some of the major cases that have come through. And I realise not everyone in the audience is from Australia, so this case may not be as familiar. But in this particular case, a cardboard packaging manufacturer colluded with their competitor and were fined, well, they were chased down for about $490 million in fines, but were eventually fined $36 million. Not only that, their CEO and general manager were both personally fined as well. So significant penalties are available to those people who breach certain areas of law, in this particular case competition law. And I think we have to make sure that our employees actually understand how that applies to them. And to bring it back down to that personal level, here's a quote from the chairman of the ACCC, the regulator who looks after competition law in Australia, Graham Samuel, at the time said, anyone who in the past has bought a block of chocolate or a piece of fruit has been ripped off by these manufacturing companies. So I think this is what I really want to get home to people when we're talking about areas of law and we get that yawn factor from our employees, that we've got to make it very clear to them that this is not something that's an abstract, that it only applies to business and that they're not going to get caught. This is something that applies in all sorts of environments and applies to us individually. For those of us not so focused on Australia, we might want to look at this particular case, and this is only came out yesterday, where Cathay Pacific and Singapore Airlines were both fined a combined $23 million for price fixing. This is an ongoing case that's affected all sorts of airlines, and in Australia the fines have exceeded $91 million so far. I believe there's about 12 airlines who have been part of this situation so far, but not only have they been fined in Australia, but they've been fined in Malaysia and Singapore and the US and so on. Now, does this particular case affect us? Well, it would affect you if you were sending cargo overseas by aeroplane, because in the past all of these providers of that service shipping your cargo either on Cathay or Singapore or any of the other airlines who are involved were colluding to fix the prices. Therefore, they weren't being competitive. Therefore, you weren't getting the best deal possible. In Australia, we also had a very famous sexual harassment case where a lady by the name of Christy Fraser-Kirk, working for department store David Jones, alleged sexual harassment against the CEO. This particular case brought on a lot of media interest because the law firm involved combined with Christy Fraser-Kirk to seek penalties of $37 million for alleged sexual harassment. I think one of the interesting things about this case was the use of different areas of legislation. I'll just quickly flick these up onto the screen so that we've got them there. Be advised that we will be distributing this information later. But the particular change that occurred here is that it didn't go through the normal Human Rights Commission, which might have sought a penalty of somewhere between $50,000 and $100,000, but she used different areas of the law to take on David Jones as a whole. She also did not only target the CEO who had allegedly sexually harassed her, she joined all of the management and the board in the action, and then sued for breach of the Fair Trading Act and other areas of law as a way of highlighting the particular areas that where she felt aggrieved, but also bringing up that number to the sensational 37 million. Now, irrespective of the fact that it never got to that point and ended up being decided, out of court, basically, they did settle, and apparently the settlement amount was nowhere near 37 million. There were some serious ramifications for David Jones in this particular case, and they included, severe brand damage. Here is a business that relies upon an image of being a female-friendly environment, and they had serious brand damage that would not only be noticed by their clients, but also perhaps in recruitment. I would suggest that the majority of the staff working at David Jones were female, and you might be a little bit gun-shy about sending your daughter or your wife to work in that sort of environment. Obviously, there was the financial settlements and the cost of the defence. There was also serious disruption to their business, and no matter what we think of Mr. McGuinness and what actually happened, he had until that time been a highly successful CEO. I think the other thing, and I've been picked up on this before, is people say, oh, well, there's no sort of indication that it affected their business in the long run. Well, I think there was. I mean, their share price back in 2008 was certainly a lot higher than it is today. And whilst we can't pin that totally to this particular issue, given that retail is having a pretty tough time generally, I think that we've got to make sure that we understand that these things can have an effect on share price and can have an effect on those people wishing to invest in our businesses. The other thing I think is, we've got to look at the ramifications are things like the emergence of litigation mixed with PR. It's not enough just to take somebody to court, but to put it into the papers is certainly being used as a weapon these days, or get it onto social media. The engagement of the directors in issues of culture and compliance has been rare up until this particular case. However, Christy Fraser-Kirk did join the board in this particular action. And I think we can see that this sort of action brings further examples of extreme litigation and will certainly push up the amount of settlement fees that people are seeking. I think we've also got to think about what compliance means in the social age and how quickly brands can be damaged. If you think that social networking is just for finding old school friends, then I think you're not facing the potential risks. A brand can be damaged very quickly overnight, by someone saying something that doesn't even necessarily have to be true. So I think we have to be very careful about how quickly the world is changing and how quickly we respond to it, and to ensure that the way we portray our brands within the social networking environment is strong enough to withstand any sort of attack that might be vicious or uncalled for. Moving into the way that we learn in business and the changes that we've seen over the last 12 years, there's a lot of talk about this particular model, and I have borrowed this particular slide from Brian Platt's at Silk Road, because I think it really points out quite clearly where we have a problem if we're just using structured learning environments. So if we are just putting people in classrooms or just putting people through online training and expecting to have an impact, we're ignoring 90% of what experiential learning might be available to us. And I don't think we should say that we can't get involved in this particular 90%, but it means that our 10% has to be used in a way that is leveraged properly, so that that discussion and the learning through experience sort of opportunities that are available are impacted by the formal training that we offer within that 10% zone. This model is looking a little bit old now, as it comes from 2010, but I think the developments are probably still pretty true, given that we've had a change in the way the economy has progressed. Up until 2008 we were rocketing away, and now we've had a hiatus for about 3 years and getting back into it now. Back in 2010, Burson and Associates were looking at where we were moving to, and there was certainly a movement towards social learning and talent management and collaborative people management that was built on this platform of training management systems and e-learning platforms. The idea being that these underlying platforms would then be leveraged into these other areas, and ensuring that those audience and content specialists were feeding information back into the other parts of the business as well as that was provided from external vendors. In addition, and I'm sure that this hasn't changed too much, and maybe the Silk Road guys will have a better picture on the way that technology is moving at the moment, most businesses are definitely moving into the learning management space, and this growth has outstripped any economic downturn that was seen in the GFC, and I think it continues to be that way. So I think we have to accept that the technologies are there and that they're growing and that they're changing, and that we will need to play a part in influencing the way in which they're used within our organisations. We can't just turn a blind eye to them. The other thing, and I'll get more onto this a little bit later in the presentation, is looking at the way in which employees are more interconnected within their workforce. Their ability to tap into people beyond the standard hierarchies and to use networks, not necessarily only within their own organisations, but perhaps with their customers, partners, peers at other businesses and so on, and use access to those people as a way of gaining information, gaining knowledge and learning from them. So this is something that we have to be well aware of, and I think the idea that people are just going to sit within a hierarchy and perhaps not communicate is an antiquated view. So we have to be very aware that that people are given the freedom to make access to access these sort of networks. So that was the detailed and heavy part of what I want to cover today, and I suppose the next part is to look at where we might be able to have some influence in this modern world, and see what we can do to ensure that our learning strategies are working for our business. So I'm going to cover 3 strategies, looking at making sure our information is relevant, identifying the contributors within your organisation, and then looking at developing an open culture of discussion. And I know that on the promo piece that was emailed out before, there was a nice quote that we'll get to from Elisabeth Murdoch, so I hope all of you managed to read that, but if not, we'll get to it. Okay, so looking at the first strategy, what we want to do is make sure that our information is relevant. There's no point giving people access to information and forcing them to do training if only 30 or 20% of it is relevant to them. They will switch off to the whole thing and give you lots and lots of pushback. So as an L&D or a compliance manager or a general counsel, you'll find it's very, very difficult to roll out training in this era of information overload that hasn't been tailored in some way to suit an organisation. We also need to look at the multiple channels of delivery. What can we do to make sure that the information is accessible in different ways? And we need to make sure that what we're giving them is relevant perhaps only to their job role, but also the company, their industry, their jurisdiction, their country, their culture. So all of this is relatively difficult. It's not cheap to build highly tailored online training. It's not cheap to deliver face-to-face training. It's not easy to fly people around and put them into meeting rooms and so on. People miss out on things and so on. But we've got this sort of balance between finding something that is cheaper, more generic, as opposed to the bespoke thing. And I think this is a challenge that we'll continue to face as we move forward, but hopefully the better the technology becomes, the more adaptable we should become. But if you could keep that graphic in mind as we walk through the next few pieces. What we look to do when we build content is to make sure that it is modularized. There's no point giving someone 3 or 4 hours of training on the privacy legislation of Australia, including a chapter on transborder data flows, if they're never actually going to send information overseas in their job. So we need to be able to trim back what is available and make sure that everything that we offer the individual is relevant to their job role, to the risk profile that they present to the business, and to their position within the organisation as a whole. Obviously, some topics are black and white and need to be covered by everyone within an organisation. So a topic like sexual harassment or bullying needs to be rolled out in a consistent manner, irrespective of where that person is located. But you may find that someone who's in a managerial position needs to review that information from perhaps a different perspective, looking at the different responsibilities someone has as a manager in dealing with complaints of sexual harassment and complaints of bullying as opposed to a standard employee. And the same goes for many different areas of law. There's no reason for someone who's simply answering phones to have a full detail analysis of why how the competition law of Australia applies to them, or how competition law applies in all sorts of other areas around the world. However, they might need to have a basic overview so that they know when to turn on the red light and ask for help from legal counsel. And so we need to make sure that what we're doing is we're pitching the information at the right level for those employees. So enabling them to have a program or a curricula that is appropriate to their job role and their level of risk in the organisation. Looking at multiple channels of delivery, it's important to understand, and everyone in the L&D space will tell you this, that people learn in different manners. For many of us, the old ways of reading text is still how we tend to learn, but for a lot of people these days, access to information, either via video or a webinar such as the one we're doing, is becoming a preferable source. So we need to make sure that when we're packaging information, that we're packaging it in a way that becomes accessible to different environments. Here we also have to consider the limitations of technology. I know some other countries have wonderful internet services and we keep on getting promised them, but there's no point delivering high density video if somebody's in remote Western Australia and can't access the internet, or can certainly not even access broadband. So thinking about multiple ways in which you might deliver the same message. Also thinking about accessibility issues too, and that's going to become a much bigger issue as we go forward. Sound and video is fantastic, it's certainly engaging, but it may not be the most appropriate delivery method for everyone. We've also got to think about, in this particular area, legal compliance, that sound and video is a lot more difficult to edit if the legislation changes. So I think having a mix of different media and having accessibility to other forms of delivery is going to be really vital as we move forward, particularly if we have a multi-generational workforce. One of the things that we've been looking into is the delivery of e-books for compliance. And I certainly think that for those of us who do tend to travel quite a bit, accessibility in an offline environment is equally as important in the online environment. However, you can't just pick up the same sort of layouts and methodologies you might use for a standard online training course. It's more sensible to look at the audience that you're talking to and see what's going to be a most appropriate form of delivery for them. Considering content interactivity, and I know that in the e-learning world in particular, there's a lot of talk about how interactive we should be, how much more interactivity we should put in, trying to cut down the amount of text that we use and so on. And I certainly think that that's the way we're going. Many of us are visual learners, and the whole process of actually having an activity within our learning piece will help us engage and stop it from being purely a page turner. That said, I think we do need to be very careful that we don't go too far. One of my concerns, and I know it's a bit of a hot topic in the online training world at the moment, is this idea of gamification, as it's called. I certainly think that we've got to be very careful that we're not 15 minutes of training and turning it into an hour of gaming. And we need to understand that, at the end of the line, when the people are actually sitting down to do their training, that they may not necessarily be interested in doing playing games. They really just want to get through the training. We also need to have a look at ourselves. Are we doing this just because we're smart and we can do it? What is the learning outcome from gamification? Now, I'm not totally dismissing it. I think there is potentially some opportunities, and particularly when we start getting into simulations and things like that, where it might be appropriate for some level of highly interactive process. But when we're talking about training literally thousands of people in basic areas of law, I think the faster we get the message through, the better. Just waiting for the screen to catch up with me a little bit. I've been pushing ahead. I'm going to move into our second strategy of looking at where we can identify contributors in our organisation. I think it's really important that the whole idea of compliance and online training and the L&D function aren't seen as isolated within the organisation. We need to look for the key influences and encourage those people to take action for themselves. We need to encourage participation within our organisation and make sure that there is ownership of the compliance function beyond just the L&D or the compliance people. And also, I think we need to create our own stories. It's all very well, and look, we're coming from the external vendor point of view, to be able for us to develop stories and cases that might be appropriate to your business. But where there are individual stories or incidents that might have happened in your organisation, then I certainly think that it's worth developing those with your people. We need to understand that our world is becoming more and more connected at all times, and that information cannot be centrally controlled anymore. And I think, if we think about what's been happening perhaps in the Arab Spring, and even further with the recent general public cry in China over issues such as corruption within politics, you're seeing that the power that information can give people is now not able to be controlled centrally. We're finding that anyone can publish information very quickly, and brands can be damaged in an instant. I saw a lovely story not too long ago about some net citizens, or netizens as they're called in China, who had identified a local government official and through 30 photographs of him recognized that he was wearing a different luxury watch in each of those photographs, and therefore was assumed to be corrupt. So this is the sort of world that we're living in, where there's no way that the government or the businesses that we work in can actually control our access to information. People with an iPhone can access Google wherever they are, sitting at their desk. They can be on Facebook, they can get onto LinkedIn or any of the other services, and they can publish information whether it's factual or not. So we need to not only look at all of that and manage the risks that are associated with it, but I think we actually need to embrace it and bring our people into the world where they actually are feeding information into the business and out to their colleagues and so on. Anyone in business can become a connector, and I think that's something that we'll get to a little bit later on about why people do it. But the whole idea behind Twitter might have seemed quite bizarre to people 10 years ago. The idea that you might write a little 140-character piece that tells people what you're doing today would have been considered quite inane a while ago. But nowadays people are interested, people will follow, and people want to be publishers. They develop their own communities of interest, and these communities of interest can develop by themselves almost overnight. So we need to be aware of that within our organisations, and perhaps promote that and encourage it within our organisations. Encouraging that connectivity will help us to disseminate information and talk about why compliance in particular is important within our organisation. I think if we front up to these issues rather than trying to sort of put on a brave face, we're more likely to be effectual in talking about the culture that we're trying to develop in our business. And I think by encouraging that conversation, we increase the relevance to our business. One of the biggest issues that everyone talks about in compliance training is this idea of relevance. How can we ensure that the people who are doing the training actually appreciate why they're doing the training? How can we lessen the amount of pushback in our organisation? I think it's really important that we start telling stories in our organisations, and I know certain businesses, in particular Deloitte here, has a great culture of telling their own stories, sharing those stories, using the current technologies to share those stories, and enhancing your compliance programs so that you've got information that is more relevant to your own business. You can have a blend of off-the-shelf content, off-the-shelf training materials, and then produce your own sort of information around the same topics to give it that relevance and to give it that framework. I think we all need to understand the power of our disaster stories as well, and most of us will remember things like the story of the Titanic. Others will think about Pompeii or the Great Fire of London. But if we look at the Visi story, which I gave you earlier, and the $36 million in fines, I'm sure that that story resonates within that business and their competitor Amcor, and it's probably part of an ongoing process of training for both those businesses and for other businesses in that industry. We need to keep revisiting those disaster stories because they're the things that people remember. The David Jones story will have life beyond the careers of those two individuals, and become part of what you can and can't do within organisations. It becomes part of the story. And there's been similar stories. There was one of the partners at one of the major accounting firms recently, or a couple of years back in Australia, who sought $10 million in penalties for sexual harassment. And it was sexual harassment much worse than what had happened in this particular David Jones case. Stories around compliance are becoming mainstream media too, and many of you might have seen the latest movie out on the Lehman disaster called Margin Call. And if you haven't, I highly recommend it. You don't have to be at all interested in compliance to find it. It's quite a fascinating movie, and it's incredibly professionally produced. I wonder if that would have been such a big movie prior to the GFC, if we'd had those sort of topics, if it had been a fiction. I think we need to be unafraid to tell our own stories, and certainly where we've gone out and started talking to clients, we've often wondered whether the scenarios and case studies we use maybe should be taken out if we're talking about a particular client. If we went and saw a construction client and we were using a case that involved them in a training piece, should we perhaps not mention it? And I think we should. I think we should actually take the front foot. And this particular screenshot that I've got up here is from a Citibank online training piece about fraud. And they use the actual example of one of their own staff who was found guilty of embezzling $22 million. Now, this gentleman borrowed a significant amount of money from the bank and used it to go night clubbing and buy cars and apartments and so on before being caught. Now it's being used as that cautionary tale, and I think this is very brave of Citigroup to actually be doing that, but I think it will give it that resonance piece that we're all looking for. So moving on to my final strategy is to develop that culture of open discussion. And I think this comes back to the ideas that we have around the way in which businesses are changing, the way in which hierarchies are breaking down, and the way in which we need to free up and give our people the authority to discuss things in the organisation. So we need to develop a culture where we talk about the way we do things around here. The reason we like to work here, the authority and autonomy we have to participate in the process. And again, this is a slide I borrowed from Brian Platts, but it talks about the new paradigm where everyone is part of that conversation rather than it all being directed from head office or the senior manager, and this is how we'll behave. In this era where everyone has access to readily available information, there's no way that we can expect to have that sort of hierarchical control. We need to embrace that new paradigm and move forward and give people the authority and the autonomy to actually be part of the process and continue to create their own stories. For those of you who are interested in a little bit of theory, there's a wonderful academic in this area called Dave Gray, and he's looked at what actually happens within social networks and looking at how you can make them more effective. I just want to touch on it here because obviously you can all go in and do a bit more of your own research in the particular area. But he has mapped in the ways in which social networks work together and where they become most powerful and who becomes the key people in a social network. And often it's not the person in authority, but it's rather the person who can connect all the dots, who sits between all of those people and can bring all the information together in one space. Now, I certainly know that Silk Road and a few of the other technology specialists around here are looking at these sort of models and helping organisations by putting this sort of mapping technology in. So well worth to look at this. The other thing I think we need to talk about is what motivates us. And many of you will be aware of Daniel Pink. He is one of the leading, most popular HR speakers on the circuit at the moment. And he's been looking at what we can do to help motivate staff, particularly in this particular age. I think, with all respect to Ms. Pink, a lot of what we can see in his theories is actually more a sort of explanation of what we would probably find in most of our businesses rather than anything new. Obviously, cash motivates people, but Daniel Pink says that it really only motivates people to a certain level, beyond which we need to empower our people, give them the autonomy to make their own decisions and mastery to become good at what they do, but also drive purpose within an organisation. And many organisations today are looking at their structures and incorporating things like CSR programs, or charity programs to give that sense of purpose within their organisation. So yes, cash does motivate people, but think about all the other motivations that are beyond cash. Once people have earned enough money or are earning a decent living to support themselves, to support their family, they're actually looking for a lot more in their career than they might have looked for in the past. So, getting back to the quote that, and I won't hide Elisabeth Murdoch's name anymore as I had done in previous ones because it's no surprise after the email that went out. I really like the idea that we look at organisations and look at what makes them great places to work. And Elisabeth Murdoch sums it up really well here by looking at what is a successful community being a great place of honesty and integrity, an environment where curiosity and enthusiasm are the norm. And I think that we'd all like to work in a place like that. Not all organisations are like that, and even those that are certainly aren't like that all the time. But if we look at our organisations and have an aim to become that way, then I think we're going to have more success. I think we want to work in a place that demands personal accountability, and that certainly accords with Daniel Pink's ideas around having personal responsibility and the autonomy to make your decision. Collective responsibilities and true self-determination are equally as important. But I particularly like the idea here that she brings out where the organisation or the community is a place where opportunity doesn't have to wait for a board meeting, a place that stimulates self-expression and encourages collaborative behaviour. And we can only have that in an environment where we trust our staff to make good decisions. And we can only trust our staff to make good decisions if we empower them to do so. So I think it's really important that we look at our organisations and say, well, have we done that? And are we actually providing them with the tools, the information, and the environment in which they can make the correct decisions? And I guess then what we're talking about is rather than a culture of compliance, we're actually talking about an ethical culture. And there's a lot of discussion on at the moment about what the difference between the two is and what works best for an organisation. I think we all want to have a compliant organisation, but I think what leads our organisations is when we develop an ethical culture. And so what we need to be looking at is giving people the empowerment and the authority to perhaps make those ethical decisions. And we've got to be very conscious that where we have rules-driven businesses that people aren't just abiding by the rules and forgetting to make their own decisions. The last thing I'd like to bring us to is this idea that we're working in an evolving culture too, that we can't just draw a line in the sand and say this is what we will be. And that obviously is the case with compliance, where we're continuing to get more and more regulation. If we look at the health industry or the financial services industry, you know, there's continually more and more regulation and legislation that has to be complied with. The recent UK Bribery Act has brought us a lot of new business, I must say, because people are saying, right, we've got more information, we've got to give to more people around the globe. The other thing I think we need to say is that ethics is a continually evolving and moving space as well, and we need to understand, you know, what is ethical today and what might not be seen as ethical tomorrow. And one of the examples we use when we're talking to people about this is the development of the polio vaccine in the late 1940s. And when they were developing the polio vaccine in the US, they were in a real rush to develop it. Polio was a horrific problem in the US and other countries, obviously, and it caused a lot of panic in the populace. So when in their rush to develop the polio vaccine, they actually used orphans and children from homes for the feebly minded, as they were called, to test out their vaccines. Now, that might have been seen as ethical in those days, but certainly wouldn't be the done thing today. So I think when we are thinking about those sort of things, that we think about, you know, how would we face an issue if it was on today's front page? And would we be happy with it being publicised, or would we be happy with our mother knowing that we did it? But also perhaps have a think about how it might be perceived tomorrow. So look, that's sort of where I want to take it to today. Just recapping on those three strategies. Relevance, I think, is a key thing when we're trying to push our message through, when we're trying to get that cut through to people who might be a bit jaded with their training. We need to make sure that it's kept up to date and that it's refreshed regularly so that they're not doing the same training year after year after year. We need to identify those contributors in our organisation who are going to help us. There's no point at just being simply the role of the legal department or the compliance department or the L&D department. We need to identify the champions in our organisation. And really what I'd like to see, and maybe this is a little bit more aspirational, is to develop that culture of open discussion and make compliance and ethics a really positive part of our organisational culture, and develop our businesses in such a way where people feel not only proud to work there, but they also help promote and discuss that culture within our organisations. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Julian. That was a fantastic presentation and a great insight into social learning strategies for compliance training. I'd like to just apologise to people there because at the beginning of the session the screen didn't show as soon as we'd hoped. So we'll just take a pause now, and we will wait for a few questions. I'll just mute, and we'll take a few questions shortly. Thanks. Okay, we've got a couple of questions coming through. Some of them aren't so much about the content at this stage, but we've got a question here from Sarah Ray. Julian, you talked about modularised training. How do you manage the difficulties with staff constantly changing roles and roles changing to incorporate new responsibilities?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. A very good question. I think it comes back to your planning when you're actually setting up your compliance training plans to make sure that you account for that. The way we develop content is designed so that it is flexible and that people might start at a particular level and then graduate through as they change job roles. Working with a combination of your content strategy and your particular LMS, you'd be looking at creating training plans that were pinned to particular job roles or risk profiles within your organisation. And I wouldn't say that you need to have hundreds of these. You might have 10 different training plans that look at a different level within your organisation of different risk profiles. The idea, though, is to make sure that as people do graduate, that they don't necessarily have to repeat the things that they did 2 months ago. If they've got a promotion from one job to the next, that they pick up just those parts of the training that represent the new risks that they're facing in their new role or as they move around the organisation.
Okay, we've got another question here from Rachel. How do we stop people becoming online weary? That's something I've heard mentioned a few times. By that I mean there seems to be a lot that we have to share with our team members on top of their normal jobs, and the content is fairly similar each year. Any suggestions?
Yeah, hi Rachel. I think that you're definitely right. It's a problem that we're all facing, and the difficulty is in looking at blanket approaches rather than individual approaches, and it comes back to finding that balance. That particular slide that I showed with the 2 orange arrows, I think it encapsulates that whole problem, that we're always trying to find a balance between a blanket approach where everyone needs everything and a customised, totally tailored approach where individuals feel that they're only getting what's relevant to them. I think you have to find that happy medium, and it may not be the same for each organisation or each job role, but also think about different delivery mechanisms and that whole piece around relevance. If people understand the relevance, then you're not necessarily going to get such a pushback, even if only 70% of what you're giving them is fresh. If you have to keep repeating the same thing in particular areas because the risk profile is high, so something like competition law or sexual harassment or bullying or any of those topics which do need to be repeated year on year, the key thing is to let people know why it's important to your business and perhaps have a piece from a senior manager, a little video that says, why is it important to this organisation? Is it because you want to recruit good staff? Is it because you want to work in a fair and equitable environment? Or is it because your customers and your consumers expect that? Once you get that relevance piece right, then people are much more open to the idea of doing the same training year on year, even though it might be seen as a bit of a push.
Thanks, Julian. We've got another quite a broad question from Manuel in the Philippines, and it's great to hear that our Asian neighbours have logged into the webinar. And Manuel asks, what are the biggest stumbling blocks in implementing a compliance program? Julian.
Manuel, that's a huge question. What's the biggest stumbling block? Generally, for most organisations, it's budget. Finding enough budget to do it properly is going to be always the biggest problem, and sadly, for most organisations, they don't find the budget until after they've had a problem. So I assure you that most organisations who end up in front of the courts in our country will suddenly find budget for a compliance program. But it's a lot harder to convince people prior to that they need one. So I think certainly that would be the biggest problem, is finding the appropriate amount of budget without them having actually had a compliance breach. Going forward, I think once you've had a couple of breaches, is keeping that relevant, keeping those stories up to date and making sure that people 10 years, 12 years after the fact, realise that it could still happen to us. As human beings, we're incredibly optimistic. If we weren't, we wouldn't get out of bed each day. If we thought the risks were too great, we just wouldn't move. But we do. We want to move on, and we tend to think that we're in nothing bad's ever going to happen to us. So I guess the biggest hurdle is convincing people that it might. And to that, I would say we need to talk up the benefits that may not be just about minimising a breach, but perhaps also look at the competitive advantages we might get from having a compliance program in place. And whether that is that we might get better recruitment outcomes, or that we might get a lower cost of capital for our business because we're more risk averse, or any of those other positive business drivers, I think incorporating those in your pitch to get your compliance program up and running will certainly be as helpful as the scary stories that we might talk about.
Thanks, Julian. All right, we're just about to conclude now, but I've actually got a question for you about the regulators, and once again, it's quite a broad question. Have you got a feel, or do you know whether the regulators are trying to address the impact of social media on compliance training? Have they made any comment about social media and the ability to control social media in compliance training? Are they still sticking by their guns in terms of having to have proof of audit? Yeah, hopefully you can answer that.
Always a tricky one, hey, Tim. Look, I'm not aware that any of the regulators in Australia are particularly drawing any lines in the sand around social media, but certainly those that are out there talking to the press are quite well aware of the dangers that social media provides, but also of the ability to share information via social media. So I guess if the point of your question is, can we track that social media interaction, and do we expect that the regulators are wanting to see evidence of that social media? Is that sort of where you were going, Tim? Yeah, thanks. I don't think that that will ever become something that needs to be 100% detailed in the courts. I think it's too difficult, it's too random. What they would be looking for in the general sort of principle is around culture. So coming back to that first sort of image that we looked at of, what was it like 10, 12 years ago, certainly they wanted to see a list of, your 1,000 staff, 95% of your people have done their training, and this is what you've done with your other 5%. These days that's not good enough. You need to have that still, but you also need evidence that you are generating a culture within your organisation that goes beyond that. So whether that's, social media messages coming down from management saying, this is the sort of company we expect our employees to be part of, or whether it's other parts of the compliance program, I think they're looking for an overall picture rather than necessarily just the auditable points within that organisation.
Okay, thank you very much, Julian. Well, that concludes our webinar on social learning strategies for compliance training. I hope those of you that logged into it found it insightful and worthwhile. Just a reminder that we will be sending around a presentation available as an online video within 48 hours. Silk Road doesn't send slide decks around, and I think I saw a question in there about the format of the recording. So that's it. It's an online video. So thank you very much, everybody, and hopefully we'll see you at our next webinar for the social compliance series at Silk Road, which is with Gina Frampton next Tuesday, same time.